Session 3 is on new tensions and challenges to Northeast Asia, and moderating, chairing this panel is my colleague, Professor Jim Feinerman from the Law School at Georgetown.
Thank you, Victor. I'm very glad to be here today, and I want to thank the organizers of this conference, the Northeast Asia History Foundation and CSIS Korean Chair for bringing us together. We have a very impressive panel, and I don't want to detract from the time that they have available to do their presentations, that our commentator has to make his comments, and the time that you will have to ask questions. I believe you have the background information in a handout, so I won't detail it except to say that I think that they will speak in the order that they're seated here at the table, starting with Professor Alexis Dudden from the University of Connecticut, then Michael Green from Georgetown and CSIS, Professor Ina Masasaki from Japan, and Professor Wang Hanlin from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in China. And then the final comments we made by our discussant, Professor Taehyung Kim from Damon College. I would just ask in advance that when we get to the period for questions, as was the case with previous panels, that people try to keep their questions brief so that we can maximize the time available since we're starting a little bit late.
Good afternoon. I'd like to thank the Northeast Asia History Foundation as well as Victor Cha for organizing all of us together. I also would like, a lot of the papers, as I'm sure people have listened over the course of the day, are realizing how much they're overlapping this morning, particularly when Professor Kang set out the longue durée of world history in his one sentence, From Frontiers to Borders. I think that's a really useful organizing strategy for understanding that we are dealing in an era of supreme nationalism, national identity, national history, whatever you want to say, the nation state is the most powerful force going. And so we're kind of dealing with nationally described problems in an international context and hopefully with international or multinational solutions. That said, I'd like to turn the focus very briefly inward, entirely inward to within Japan's national borders, and particularly to some people. And we haven't really talked about a lot of people today. Also, I have one caveat. I am a historian still practicing history, and that's not a bad thing. It does mean, however, that I actually don't care if what I say gets implemented as policy. And I don't have to. It's an enormously liberating thing, actually. Because as Professor Feinerman just mentioned, he didn't know there was a Tea Party in Japan, and there really isn't. And the title of my paper is The Tea Party in Japan. I'm using that, obviously, as a way to get attention to the group of people about whom I wish to speak briefly, and also because the driving forces behind this loose group of unnamed, unformed people share two very specific features with the American Tea Party movement, which is a quicksanding economy and anti-immigration, actually I'm now currently calling them the anti-everythingers, because I think that's basically what they are. And the first way I'd like to describe this is through the question of poverty. There are people, many prominently placed people, who would argue there isn't poverty in Japan. And to be very honest, obviously in a region that includes the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, to even suggest that Japan is poor is not just out of place, it's unseemly. That said, and you know, when we watched the latest scandal in Japan about centenarians, either 235,000 of whom may be 180 years old and living off of welfare, it's kind of difficult to feel that this system is really understanding how to take care of the society. However, what I am talking about is hemorrhaging real or perceived daily economic life for most Japanese, and it found its truest, clearest expression in 2009 when the LDP lost its half-century of rule. And I do think that an economic analysis of what was driving a lot of the voters is useful. It's not necessarily just Marxist. It's actually probably substantial, you can actually make a point about it, so I'm going to. And I think one of the most interesting things about Hatoyama Yukio's victory was his cabinet's decision to make government transparent. Now, this obviously isn't going to happen overnight, but that probably the most interesting thing that happened was a month in October 2009, when the Labor Ministry decided to make public a lot of its demographic data for the first time in 21st century Japanese history, in the sense that not only had the 1990s bubble burst been really, really bad, but that 1 in 6 Japanese people, as of 2007, were living in poverty. And, similar data has just been released in the United States, arguing 1 in 7 in the United States. The 1 in 6 number in today's Japan equals roughly 20 million 20 million documented Japanese, meaning not homeless, not foreigners, living below the ministry's determined poverty line of $22,000 for a family of 4. And anybody who's in this room has spent a weekend or a week in Tokyo can understand that a family of 4 living in Japan on $22,000 a year is difficult. What has been fascinating, I spent the last year living in rural Japan, and probably the most noticeable feature of the year was the shift in the national discourse. And a shift in the discourse from a sort of pleasantly progressing forward, consuming middle-class Japan to newspapers, blogists, pundits focusing on economically related suicides, domestic violence, and child abuse, features of a quicksanding economy, one could argue. To me, in social terms, again, not policy terms, in social terms, it became important to ask what was actually selling well. And I would argue that nationalism, and particularly an extremist form of nationalism, is what is the hottest commodity in Japan right now. Examining this kind of nationalism is more than an alarmist concern with the rise of the right. This is precisely because their demands and expectations, like the American Tea Partiers, differ markedly in form from the neutered or studiously ignored extremist nationalisms of the past half-century. The kind of nationalism in Japan that is selling very well is fast, cheap, and out of control. Let me be clear that not all of its creators are new to the political scene, many are, but and this is the clear part of my argument, what is absolutely new is the insistence that open calls for violence be part of the scene. Their content, the anti-foreign, pro-purity of blood ideas in Japan are far from new. But the ability to speak, say, publish, argue these things in a clear manner that insist upon violent means to achieve these ends, I would argue, is a very new feature of the Japanese political scene. David Kim of the Asia Foundation made a very useful suggestion to me over lunch, and I'd like to mention it. What I'm trying to say is, if we remember 1995 and the sarin subway attack failed, arguably, unfortunately not for the people affected, but it failed because those who were supposed to stab the bags of sarin with their umbrella, the points of their umbrellas on the subway that morning, lost their courage. And when the sarin bags didn't break, they left the bags. And the way that the subway conductors died, for example, was cleaning up. I would make the case, and this is a broad statement, but I would make the case that the new Tea Partiers wouldn't lose their courage, insofar as these are a group of unincorporated Japanese who believe they have nothing to lose. And I'm going to try and back that up as best as possible. And I am going to jump ahead of a part of my paper, but incorporate some of it because I became profoundly aware of the importance of treating this group of people with an international lens in the city of Matsue in February of this year, because on February 22nd, the Japan side of the Dokdo Takeshima problem celebrates what's called Takeshima Day. This is a holiday that began in 2005 to celebrate, again from the Japan side's perspective, the 100th anniversary of the incorporation of the islands into Shimane Prefecture. Never mind, nobody bothered in 1905 to ask Korea what they thought about, but Korea would lose much of its sovereignty that year anyway. Fast forward almost 100 years, Shimane Prefecture has perpetually been one of Japan's most impoverished and inward-looking regions. And in the late 1990s, when the topic of fishing EEZs reemerged on the national scene, Shimane, we're in southwestern Japan on the coast of the Japan Sea, East Sea, when the late 1990s fishing disputes emerged, local Shimane politicians decided that they really were going to push Tokyo and that they wanted this to be part of a national definition and a strong national definition for Japan. In 2005, the Shimane Prefectural Assembly launched the holiday, and this year was the 5th anniversary of Takeshima Day. So I went. And this day in particular this year made clear to me a conundrum in looking at nationalism versus nationalism. And I understand that that's an ambiguous distinction, but this became very clear to me at the Takeshima Archive Office, which is Matsue's counter to the numerous Dokdo offices, particularly the one on Olungdo or in Seoul. And its stated purpose is to research Takeshima. The Takeshima one is funded by the prefecture. It's located at the base of Matsue's famous castle, which is up for World Heritage status. And as I was buying pamphlets and DVDs and collecting all the free Takeshima is ours buttons, one of the unmarked black hate buses that drives around Japan slowed down in front of the intersection of the archive office and turned its invective away from Koreans writ large and just the word Korea, and turned the yelling to inside within the walls of the archive, shrieking at the staff, "You idiots, you're selling away Japan with your incompetence." The archive staff was quite shaken, but this really brought to me the difference that I'm trying to get at the beginning here, which is it's been one thing when Japanese rightists threaten supporters of the comfort women. It's a whole new ballgame when they're openly threatening those who are advocating a similar political goal, which is Takeshima is Japan's. So the question for me is, in the context of threats to Northeast Asia, will these new outliers, and I'd like to, I think I have a picture. What do I hit for the PowerPoint? I just have a picture of the kind of face I'd like to have people have in mind. I think it's on the... Just two pictures that I took myself, which means they're out of focus, and I apologize for that. I think that, well, they could start with that one, yeah. Thanks. The driver of this truck, and I just would like to leave the other one up, the next one. There's one more, if we close that, and I'd like to leave this one up, please. And I guess this is what I mean by the largest number of, one of the groups I follow is now up to 10,000 members. It had 3,000 members in March. You apply over the internet, you don't have to donate any money. But when I make the distinction that we're dealing with a new kind of activist in Japan, I want to underscore that this is a group of people who believes they have nothing to lose. That's the sort of common definition, because they already feel so alienated from Japanese society. Okay. So, the current extremist behavior observed over the last 2 years suggests that newcomers to the disorganized ranks are upping the ante and are not content with being a tolerated fringe. Again, the norm is public and open demand for violence within Japan against those deemed detrimental to their meaning of Japanese identity. Also normal are calls for preemptive military strike outside of Japan. Never mind holding a public debate about Article 9, its erasure is a foregone conclusion. Now, unsurprisingly, in this line of reasoning, targeting North Korea is a given, yet for the emergent Tea Partiers, especially in Matsue, the same holds true for South Korea. Kankoku is also up for military strike because of the island dispute, which adds, I would argue, a noticeably new flavor to their claims. Historians of the future are going to, have fun naming who's responsible for all of this. At the moment, I'm just going to blame Ishihara Shintaro. But a much more historically important figure may, however, be a man named Sakurai Makoto, who goes by the nom de guerre Dorompa and is described by journalist David McNeil as Japan's dapper demagogue. He has a predilection, he's 38 years old, he likes three-piece suits, bow ties, and watch fobs. In 2010, I would argue that he's emerged as the front-runner of the new outliers with elaborately staged and self-promotional calls for violence in the name of protecting Japan and its people's apparently homogenous national identity. Perhaps to avoid sharing the spotlight on Takeshima Day, he held his own anti-Korean, anti-foreigner, anti-Article 9 protests in Osaka outside the Korean consulate there. What was interesting to me was in the leaflets he distributed throughout the Kansai region and on the internet, was his incorporation of the emperor into the message to gather supporters that day. And it was loosely translated, no emperor to Korea, take back Takeshima from Korea by force. The Japanese government must take back Takeshima by force using its military power. The emperor will go to Korea only when Takeshima is returned. Now, of course, to be sure, in the specificity of 2009-10, Sakurai Makoto was seizing on the soft target of Ozawa's sensationalized arranged meeting with a visiting Chinese dignitary months before. From a more historical standpoint, however, his association of the Japanese emperor with the physical world of territory was actually quite new in Japanese history, because across time, in the place now called Japan, the title Tenno, for emperor, has always differed from equivalent titles around the world in not having specific land attached to the title. Think of anybody in Europe, for example. Charlemagne had how many? I wish I knew, but there were just lines after the man's name in terms of what he controlled. That hasn't been how Tenno has ever been described in Japanese history. So this is kind of new. Conditioning an imperial visit to Korea on Japan's assured control of the disputed islands, Dokdo, Takeshima, does several things at once. One, it blends Dorompa's message into broader passions in centrist Japanese nationalism that seek to expand and secure Japan's borders. Two, it reinvigorates the emperor's role in Japanese politics with a new twist, and really sort of a militarized, an excessively militarized Prussian model from the 1870s, and probably most important politically, it ingratiates Dorompa and his new band of followers with the old boy rightists, especially the wildly popular and wildly popularized cartoonist pundit Kobayashi Yoshinori, whom he's most famous for the Sensoron on war, and about whom I wish I never ever had to publish or speak again, but he's too popular to ignore and arguably too influential to ignore. And watching his effect on Sakurai Makoto and the Sakurai Makoto-like guys right now is instructive, because Dorompa was born at a time in 1972 wherein he grew up and was able to study Japan's 20th century history under Kobayashi Yoshinori's cloud, or at least through the Kobayashi effect, or famous brand of storytelling in which a fact is a fact if the author says so, regardless of what actually happened, let alone if there's any context for it. And not unusually, an imaginary past is currently appearing to unite these new, younger extremists, that is, those urging violence, together with their older, more established mentors, those who have spent the last 20 years gathering sort of loose, disorganized followers by preach teaching what it could mean to be Japanese if only everything were different. And this is the face of the follower about whom I'm speaking. In this space, the rudimentary fantasies converge, most importantly that Japan fought a war of liberation, that only masochistic Japanese historians and evil America writ large have sought to rewrite into a web of lies. The anti-Americanist feature of this group is really quite strong. And so, in briefest of terms, two things become increasingly important in terms of whether this group of people gain the momentum that has given their American counterparts focus and force: money and the question of the emperor. The first factor, like the American Tea Party, will be easier to measure. If as has happened here, Japan's anti-everythingers can attract big money, and especially if they can do so from established channels in Tokyo, these people will emerge, I believe, as a powerful political force, democratic or otherwise. Their ability to achieve this may ultimately rotate around the second matter of the emperor's future place in Japanese society, which arguably from their perspective would be a rational organizing tact. This will be harder to follow, and we can talk about any of these things later, but thank you.
Thank you, and I want to, as the Japan chair at CSS, I want to thank Victor for hosting this conference on Takeshima. Just kidding. Just kidding. Actually, I was fascinated by Professor Dudden's presentation, and I may have the unwelcome honor of being the only person in this room who has actually appeared in Kobayashi Yoshinori's manga 2 years ago, because I was quoted as telling then Prime Minister Abe that it was a mistake the way he was handling the comfort woman issue, and also Tokto, and that it was not in Japan's national interest. It was a sort of a realist foreign policy statement. And the next thing I knew, the next issue of Gomanism, there I was, this face you see, but with fangs, with a large Asahi Shimbun flag behind me. He doesn't capture you. Did you see it? You thought I was scarier than I really am. With a large Asahi Shimbun flag behind me saying, Mike Green, leader of the anti-Japan faction, tells Japan to apologize for its history. And then it was a shocking, as you'll recall, 2 pages of, basically the only word for it is pornographic violence. We should get back into this topic. I have some views on it, but having been a subject of this particular group, some experience with it too. I want to talk, the topic I'll talk about is new challenges and tensions in Northeast Asia. It's a broad topic. International relations theorists predicted at the end of the Cold War various things would happen in Northeast Asia. Realists predicted that changes in the balance of power would create a situation that was ripe for rivalry, as Aaron Friedberg put it. And he was right. Others, liberal institutionalists, said, no, economic integration, the end of the Soviet threat, would create a new community, an East Asia community, epistemic communities, interdependence, and they were right. So basically, international relations theory is great stuff and not terribly conclusive or helpful at actually defining at the end of the day what's happening in Asia. And history has a much stronger hold on reality, I find. And one of the things worth considering in a conference on history and current relations in Northeast Asia is the impact of one period of history on Asia today, and that's the Cold War. And I know that Misha Oslin and others have talked about the legacy of the Cold War in Asia today, and it's quite profound, especially in Korea. It affects not only international relations or North-South relations because of the division of the peninsula, but it explains the deeply polarized political culture within Korea, polarization within Taiwan, and even within Japan, where the current confusion in Japanese politics, I think, is mostly about the death throes of the LDP and the 1955 political system, which was itself a product of the Cold War. So the legacy of the Cold War in domestic politics in Northeast Asia, in the obvious divisions on the Korean Peninsula and the Taiwan Strait is profound. But I argue in my paper, and I was trying to think of a different way to look at a topic Victor Cha and I look at all the time, which is international relations in Northeast Asia. And I was interested in thinking about the Cold War and the impact of the Cold War in a different way. And that is, I think we are entering a phase where relations among the big powers in Asia and tensions are being increased because major powers are anticipating or expecting different ways that the Cold War is going to end. The reason international relations theorists have such a hard time capturing Asia or the reason that liberal institutionalists and hardcore realists can both be right, is because Asia is essentially, Northeast Asia in particular, stuck between two eras. It's stuck between the Cold War era and the post-Cold War era. We aren't really in the post-Cold War era in Asia because the Cold War is infusing everything. But what's new over the last year or two that relates to this is, as I said, the way that people expect or anticipate the Cold War might end, and that we might enter this new phase of history in Beijing, Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington. And I think one of the more striking trends in the region is this divergence in expectations about how this will happen. Starting with the Korean Peninsula. When Victor and I were in the NSC, we spent most of our time on the North Korea problem focusing on the diplomacy of the six-party talks, which was an intense and usually frustrating effort to try to find a way to convince the North Koreans to give up their nuclear weapons through a series of verifiable and irreversible steps. Initially, when Secretary Powell first proposed the six-party talks to Jiang Zemin in Beijing in February 2003, the Chinese wanted nothing to do with it. Powell proposed this multilateral forum idea, and Jiang Zemin said, he laughed, and he said, this is a problem between the DPRK and the US. And Powell said once again, no, we need to do this multilaterally. It's a regional problem. And Jiang laughed and said, no, it's a problem between the US and the DPRK. And they did this 3 or 4 times, and finally Powell said, let me be clear, Mr. President, if we're going to solve this diplomatically, pregnant pause, it's going to have to be through the six-party talks. And Jiang said, looked very serious and said, I see what you mean. The Chinese were brought into this reluctantly at first, but then embraced the process. So that by the time Victor was going to the talks, they had six-party talk pencils, pen cases, collectibles. It was an institution. The only thing they didn't have was skits, thank God. The very positive effect of this was that now, despite the differences in priorities about the peninsula, the Chinese emphasized, as everyone knows, stability more than denuclearization and all the rest of it. Despite some tensions between Washington and Seoul, despite all of this, Japan, China, the US, Korea, and Russia were working on the premise that the nuclear problem was a regional problem and that the solution had to be regional. And in a sense, that built some real confidence. It built confidence because everyone was working on an immediate project together and put off discussions of or thinking about where this all went. The negotiations were extremely tactical, especially at the end, 2008, extremely tactical, the nature of verification protocols. What happened was, I think, with the subsequent 2 nuclear tests in North Korea, Kim Jong-il's stroke, and then perhaps most important of all, the Cheonan sinking, assumptions about the future changed. And this mask or this sort of blind that kept all of the powers from thinking about the future and kept the powers focused on the immediate process of denuclearization and focused on the North Korea that is, not the North Korea that will be, that mask, that cloud, that screen went away. And what came next was a divergent set of expectations about what would come next. For Seoul, for Washington, and I think for Tokyo, although with the DPJ it's a work in progress, the basic assumption shifted. The expectation after the nuclear tests that the six-party talks and diplomacy would lead to denuclearization dropped precipitously. I think there is no senior official in this Obama administration, despite the president's campaign promises about using diplomacy. I don't think there's anyone in the senior levels of this administration who thinks North Korea will be at all serious about negotiating away its nuclear weapons. So the expectations of diplomacy have gone way down. Meanwhile, there is a growing anticipation that the post-Kim Jong-il succession will not go well, and that we may be reaching, in effect, the end of the Cold War on the Korean Peninsula, and that the logical result and the right result is unification. And so the focus increasingly in Seoul and Tokyo and more and more in Japan is how do we deal with instability? How do we deal with post-Kim Jong-il succession? How do we deal with the possibility of regime collapse and unification? Because it's not only increasingly likely, but it's also the only way people see to actually end the nuclear weapons problem on the Korean Peninsula. So that has shifted the thinking to the future, to contingency planning, to containment of the problem, and to an expectation that unification on the South's terms is the outcome. And you can clearly hear in the Lee Myung-bak government comfort with this, a comfort level that Roh Moo-hyun and Kim Dae-jung did not have. China, meanwhile, has looked at the same situation. I think the consensus in Beijing is very different. Whatever the Chinese assessments of the viability of post-Kim Jong-il stability in North Korea, it's quite clear that Beijing intends to make sure there isn't instability. And in spite of the nuclear tests, and in spite of the uncertainties about succession, and especially in spite of the Chonan, Beijing has fallen to a default position, not a new position, but a default position of reinforcing stabilization and implicitly slowing unification. Instability is threatening for Beijing in the short term because of refugee flows and all of the problems it brings. Unification is strategically threatening in the long run. So the anticipation in Beijing is that the end of the Cold War should not come too soon, and that the buffer state that is North Korea should be sustained. And as Beijing on the one hand, Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington on the other anticipate the future of the region and how the Cold War will end, this divergence is increasing suspicion, mistrust, and tension, because they are two fundamentally different visions of how the Korean Peninsula should look in the future. Taiwan is another example. At first glance, the Taiwan Strait, the relationship between Taipei and Beijing, is moving out of the Cold War mode. Ma Ying-jeou has negotiated successfully an ECFA, an Economic Cooperation and Framework Agreement, that will increase confidence and economic interdependence with the mainland. He's clearly moved away from the independence rhetoric of his predecessor, Chen Shui-bian, and in many ways, Chen Shui-bian's line has been discredited even for many in the pan-Green camp who originally supported it. So on the surface, it would appear that the future of the Cold War and the way the Cold War will end in the Taiwan Straits should be peaceful, may lead to unification. I think that is probably how Beijing views it, that the growth in China's military and political and economic power over Taiwan and Taiwan's growing economic dependence on the mainland are pointing to a future where unification is more likely. And the Chinese rhetoric and the Chinese position has changed. 10 years ago, Beijing put out a white paper on Taiwan, which put basically a deadline on unification, worried that if they didn't get on it, Taiwan might drift away. Beijing's stance since 2005 has been less urgent and immediate, a sense that history is on their side. The problem is I don't think that that's an accurate reading of where the Taiwan people are. Ma Ying-jeou did well with the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement, but he's had absolutely no luck in getting substantive threat reduction measures from the Chinese. The next obvious step would be a confidence-building negotiation, some sort of peace and framework agreement across the strait to capitalize on the economic cooperation and transfer that to the security side. It's not likely to happen. And it's not likely to happen because the people of Taiwan, a majority of them, don't want unification, at least not anytime soon. They want a more normal economic relationship with China. And so Ma Ying-jeou's stance has been no unification, no violence, no independence, the three no's. And that's about as far as he can go. There won't be a confidence-building exercise or mechanism possible for Taiwan unless the Chinese side engages in some concrete threat reduction. But from Beijing's point of view, history is going in their direction. History is on their side. Why should they stop doing what's working? Why should they take away the stick they need to ensure that should another pan-Green candidate come along, they have the coercive tools they need to keep Taiwan from going independent on the path towards unification? So diverging expectations about where the Cold War and how the Cold War will end in the Taiwan Strait is also, I think, in spite of the generally good trends, an undertow or a residual problem that means the Taiwan Strait situation may not be as stable as it is right now going into the future, particularly since popular support for Ma Ying-jeou's efforts are limited. And it is not out of the question that pan-Green candidates could come back into power. So this diverging expectations game in Northeast Asia, particularly about how the Cold War will end, is a source of uncertainty and tension that we're not used to because we've been used to different approaches, like the six-party talks. And so the challenge diplomatically for the United States and for the other powers is how to construct diplomacy in the region so that we are building confidence about the future and reducing the threat and tension that comes from these diverging expectations. I think there are different dimensions to this. Frankly, one of them is Washington and Seoul need to, and in fact have been, clearly demonstrating that North Korea's provocative behavior is unacceptable through sanctions and through other military exercises and defensive measures, sending a signal not only to Pyongyang but to Beijing that the consequences of North Korea's provocative behavior are going to be a complication of Chinese assumptions that through economic interdependence, Seoul would gradually move closer to Beijing, and then through aid and other measures, China would have some control over the transition in the north. And I think that in Beijing, the lesson is being internalized that you can't have your cake and eat it too. That with North Korean provocations, you have to choose more than in the past. But I think it goes beyond sort of correcting assumptions in that way. I think there has to be some form of multilateral diplomacy in Northeast Asia. It's been talked about for a long time. The challenge is, how do you do it with North Korea in the room? The six-party talks in the joint declaration in 2005 agreed to set up a working group on a Northeast Asia peace framework. Japan strongly objected for some very good reasons. How can you have a Northeast Asia peace and framework agreement with a country that has nuclear weapons? And after the 2 nuclear weapons tests, it became an even more untenable proposition. So how do you get that confidence building about the future without North Korea in the room? And the obvious answer is you have to do it with 5 parties. And my sense is that in Washington, Seoul, and Tokyo, governments are ready to do that. And that Russia is pretty close. So the real question has to be discussed and answered in Beijing. Is Beijing ready to build the kind of framework and discussions that will build confidence about the future, even if it has some short-term negative effects on Beijing's relations with North Korea? And my guess would be that although China's resisting this, that's not necessarily going to be Beijing's position forever. I think when Wen Jiabao, the premier of China, went to the trilateral Japan-Korea-China forum in Seoul, he came away quite shocked, by all accounts, at how angry the South Koreans were, and the Japanese, at China's handling of the Chonan incident. And I would not accept it as a given that China will never agree to this kind of confidence-building exercise. And I think for diplomats heading to Beijing, I'm thinking of somebody in this room in particular, this ought to be a very high priority for not only Japanese and Korean, but also U.S. diplomacy in the region. Thank you.
Can I put off this photograph? Thank you. Thank you. I'm coming from Japan. And recently, my specialty is constitutional law. And recently, Japanese constitutional law scholar living in Sri Lanka. And so, frankly speaking, we belong to the minority group. But today, I'm a constitutional specialist. So I'd like to emphasize what is the meaning of the future constitutional amendment in Japan. And this morning's session, the former Prime Minister Hatoyama's idea of East Asian community is unrealistic. But recently, there was very, very pragmatic and good idea of the East Asian community possibility. So today, I'd like to introduce you. So, sorry, I'm not a native English speaker. Just follow my manuscript. And second page, please. So I'm a Japanese constitution problem. So as a matter of fact, the establishment of the Constitution of Japan, as you know, was a joint venture of the SCIAP and Makassar, and then Japanese Prime Minister Shidehara Kijuro, and with specialists of the American New Dealers. But however, objectively, it has a meaning of the pledge of the Japanese people to be no more war state to the neighboring Asian countries. Especially, we should make sure that today I'd like to emphasize the meaning of the Article 9. So adoption of Article 9 and the people's movement after the end of the war, so using it as a weapon have prevailed against making Japan a militarily big country during 63 years. So, as you know, first half of the 20th century, so today's conference theme is history. So just think about the history. So Asia was a continuation of the wars. Sino-Japanese War, Spanish-American War, Russo-Japanese War, First World War, Siberian intervention, sending troops to Shandong, the Manchurian incident, the Second Sino-Japanese War, and the Asia-Pacific War. So in the Second World War, you know, over 20 million people died in this area. And Asia was literally the original place of wars. And this fact is very important to me and to all of you. That fact is the almost all wars in Asia were caused only by Japan. So, you know, in other words, if Japan did not exist, or if the Japanese imperialism was not alive, all wars in the first half century of 20th century would never occur. Then after the end of the Second World War, can we see the peace has been really realized? The answer is no. After the end of the Second World War, this area is a front line of the Cold War and the ignite point of war. So many people were died. But we, Japanese, experienced the occupation under the United Nations, and we cooperated America, so economically and politically. However, this point I'd like to stress to you, we never dispatched our troops. So to say exactly, we, Japan, could not do that because Japan adopted the Japan-US Mutual Security Treaty and established self-defense forces in 1954, but the SDF have kept a quite unique character. That is, SDF have never killed any foreigners and Japanese citizens since its establishment till today. So some people say SDF are very curious military, yes, but Supreme Court did not say this is constitutional yet. And Japan is an abnormal country. This phrase is, as you know, called by the Ozawa Ichiro. And the constitution, the movement have regulated the government in various ways, so many various ways. And we have Yasukuni Shrine, okay. But Yasukuni Shrine is one kind of the religious corporation. Yes, Prime Minister Koizumi worshipped there officially, but it was still the private owned. It was not state owned. This fact is very important. And page 3. So recently, this is the analysis of Professor Watanabe Osamu of Hitotsubashi University in Tokyo. And he pointed out the relationship of making Japan militarily big country, the pushing through her structural reform and the constitutional amendment is as follows. The only purpose of the revision of Article 9 is neither related to making the SDF constitutional existence, but to authorize of dispatching the SDF overseas with the aim of exercising armed forces. And on the second issue of the evolution of the structural reform and the constitutional amendment, the dismantlement of the social integration, as already Professor pointed out. So recently, we experienced it like another countries. So LDP politics completely changed. So Japanese society radically changed. So in order to adapt this radical change, the constitution amendment is needed. Not only the constitutionalization of the SDF, but my hypothesis, and this hypothesis is Professor Watanabe, is in order to adopt a Japanese state system, it is called Shiba Ryotaro's Kono Kuni no Katachi. The constitution means is a fundamental shape of the society, the state. So, for example, in order to adapt, the constitution should be completely changed. So, as you know, we can see the impulse of using a constitution as a lever of the selection of social integration. So this was born. So we can find presently two types of constitutional amendment plan. One is the hierarchical type society with state plan, and another is the community type with the nationalism type, like Kobayashi no Ishinomiya. Kobayashi Yoshinobu always tear up. So this country is not independent. This country should be independent. Okay, our relationship between US is not equal. So we should be independent. This is an ultra-right style. So this is, for example, the fundamental reason of the education fundamental law was completely changed 2 years ago or 3 years ago. But these two types of social integration are in conflict, but the common types of plan is a common characteristic. That is, they deny and take hostile stances against the freedom, democracy, individual, and the equality principle of the Constitution. They request for the fundamental transformation of the constitutional principles. So I have not much minutes, but recently we published one book, and the summary of that book points three future courses. So one course is to support the American present regime foreign policy and global arms building in a world where US has become the only post-Cold War superpower. And, but this option will inevitably lead Japan to make a formal amendment to the Constitution. And second future course is the more strength US-Japan diplomatic relation in which the US government and the military, industrial, academic complex of both nations will compel Japan to adopt the policy of the de facto amendment of the Constitution. But the third, I think, is to reaffirm, yes, peace clause seems to be dead letter, but this is still living. So our constitutional scholar fundamental policy is to reaffirm Japan's peace constitution and the supreme law of the land. And we believe the third option is the most appropriate for us, not only Japan, but the neighboring countries. And I hurriedly skip to the page 5. So if we take the third option, we must change our current doing nothing, but always following US policy only. So for the truly serious attempt for a positive policy transformation, not only Japan, but also by Korea, China, and USA, we can confer the GPAC idea. GPAC is, this is a civil society's movement, Global Partnership for the Prevention of Armed Conflict, Northeast Asia Regional Action. So we can see the GPAC idea. We can see how to strengthen the six parties conference and how to make more peaceful world and peaceful and prosperous area in this world. And just 2 minutes maybe. So, and please page 6. Recently, Professor Sasagawa Noriaki of Meiji University studied An Jung-geun's resistance spirit and his peace argument and concluded his article with 3.1. An Jung-geun had resistance spirit combined with nationalism and Christianity. Second, from the standpoint of international law, his peace argument was based on self-independent stance and was a clear antithesis to the aggression into Korea. 3, if we take the position of future drafting of our kind of East Asian community, we should take his self-independent argument very seriously. So Sasagawa says, An's peace argument as Asia is composed of each independent state that recalls us Immanuel Kant's Zum ewigen Frieden. Sasagawa analyzes as An's peace argument through Kant. And so, conclusion, I think An's argument, this argument was, this argument was announced 100 years ago when he assassinated Ito Hirobumi. But his idea of Oriental peace is very important. I think this point is not only Japan, Korea, and the United States, Russia, and North Korea, Taiwan, and this Northeast area is the only area which never experienced. We are still suffering of the past memory of colonialism, past memory of the so many miserable things, but this area, we are still suffering the nuclear problems, and so we should look forward and make great progress to the realization of the East Asian community. And this idea, please look at page 7, footnote 8. This is 4 independent Japanese scholars' joint venture of the Tamio Nakamura's edited East Asian Regionalism from a Legal Perspective. This idea is mainly ASEAN plus 3, yes. Plus 3 is China, Korea, and Japan. So this seems to be, USA seems to be excluded from this category, but this is not wise. And USA, of course, superpower, and former Russia, former Soviet. And another country who support this idea, that is a universal human rights concept and the universal idea of the each nation's sovereignty and peaceful prosperity, and this idea must be realized by our joint venture. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the History Foundation and CSIS for providing me an opportunity for sharing ideas with so many distinguished experts and scholars here. My topic is the recent incident happened near the Dewey Island and its impacts on the East China Sea situation. Because the topic of this conference is history, it's the major topic, so I will talk history first. Today in the US, it is September 17th, but in China, it's 18th. September 18th was a bad day for China. In 1931, September 19th, Japan attacked the Chinese troops in the northeast China and launched a war against China and occupied the northeast China. And this has something related to the recent case. I would like to discuss about the instance which happened on September the 7th from the perspective point of view of history, law, and politics. First of all, I will briefly introduce about the incident. I assume that everyone here know more or less about the incident and the brief history of the Dewey Island. In Japanese is Senkaku. About the incident, on September the 7th, a small Chinese fishing boat was hit by 2 Japanese Coast Guard ships hit twice, and the ship and the crew, including the captain, were arrested by the Japanese Coast Guard. Until now, the captain was still under arrest for obstructing officers on duty. After hearing this bad news, his 85-year-old grandmother died. And a Japanese court ruled on September the 10th that the captain could be detained until September 19th, when prosecutors have to decide whether to lay former judges against him. This is related to the history and the ownership and the dispute of the Dewey Island. So we have to say something about the dispute about the Dewey Island. It is a long history and complicated issues related to the dispute, but I just want to emphasize several points. First, the Chinese historical evidence about the ownership of the island is 400 years before Japan claimed discovery of the island. This history was recognized even by some Japanese professors. Second, there are some international agreements recognize this. For example, the 1943 agreements of the Cairo and the Potsdam Declaration mention that all the territories Japan has stolen from the Chinese should be returned to China, including the Dewey Islands. Second, the 1951 treaties of peace between Japan and the Allied powers, including the US. And third, the peace treaty between Japan and China in 1952, and then the 1978 Sino-Japan Peace and Friendship Treaty all recognize this. Especially, I need to point it out that in the 1978 Treaty of Peace and Friendship between China and Japan clearly mentioned that the disputes should be settled peacefully, and the two sides agree to set aside the disputes. And the US position. The US is actually the one who planned these seeds of disputes, because as we note, when in the 1970s, the US returned Okinawa to Japan, it includes the Dewey Islands. And just now, our American colleagues said the US did not take sides on this dispute. In practice, Japan conducted patrol in the adjacent seas of the Dewey Island, and China, including the mainland China and Taiwan, also conduct fishing activity and patrol in the adjacent seas of the disputed islands. For example, on 8 December 2008, the China Sea civilian ships patrol the islands. And I should mention that in order to promote friendship relations and pursue a win-win compromise with Japan, the late Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping proposed the two countries seek joint development of Dewey Island while setting aside the disputes over the ownership of them during the negotiation and signing of the 1978 treaty between China and Japan about their peace and friendship. So we have the historical evidence and legal documents here expressly state about the disputed islands. And how about the impact of the September the 7th incident of the East China Sea situation? First of all, I would like to say from the legal perspective, Japan has no right to conduct so-called legal enforcement in the adjacent seas of the Dewey Island, as mentioned by the Chinese government. Second, from a political perspective, Japan's action have serious harmed Sino-Japanese relation in general and the cooperation in the East China Seas in particular. And the incident has developed into a diplomatic crisis between the two sides. First, China has decided to postpone the Sino-Japanese negotiation on the East China Sea issue. As we note that in June 2008, China and Japan reached an agreement on the joint development of the East China Sea. In this so-called principal consensus on joint development, China and Japan agree on a joint development zone which is across the median line. Second, the Chinese oil and gas companies welcome their Japanese counterparts to invest and exploit the oil and gas in the existing Chinese oil and gas field in the East China Sea. This is considered to be in favor of Japan and allows doubts or even protest in China. Some young Chinese people protest in front of the Ministry of Affairs in Beijing. And some netizens call me saying, how can you do that? How can you reach an agreement with Japan like this? I told them that I did not do that. I did not participate in the negotiation. But as we note, the Chinese people, the ordinary Chinese people, and even some high-ranking officials are not happy with the Sino-Japanese principal consensus on the joint development of the East China Sea. So, for Japan, this principal consensus is really in favor of Japan. And after the agreement on the joint development, because many Chinese people are unhappy and they protest the agreement, so the Chinese government has to postpone or delay in further pushing the joint development. And another reason for this is that Japan misinterpret on purpose about some provisions of the agreement. In this case, the Japanese embassy people call me and invite me for dinner and ask me to support pushing the joint development for several times. But during this September incident, I also called them to release immediately the captain, preferable between September 18th. We know September 18th is the 79th anniversary of the September 19th incident. I told the Japanese embassy people who in charge of during this incident, I told them that it's better to release the captain before the commemoration of this incident. Otherwise, there may be some protest in Beijing and around China. And until now, I have no any further news about this incident. And I hope Japan can release unconditionally the captain and stop the so-called legal process. And about the impact of the incident, just now I mentioned China has decided to postpone the Sino-Japanese negotiation on the East China Sea, especially the 2008 principal consensus on joint development. Second, China sent law enforcement ships to the adjacent seas of the Dewey Island to protect Chinese fishermen and stop Japanese survey ships working there, which demonstrates China's sovereignty and jurisdiction in the area. And third, the incident has allowed anti-Japanese sentiment and a new long-term movement of defending the Dewey Island among Chinese, both at home and abroad, including here in the US. The movement first took place in the US when the US handed over the administrative power of the islands to Japan in 1971. As we know, the Taiwanese leader, Ma Ying-jeou, was one of the major organizers of this movement in 1971. And fourth, there are some change of position on the Dewey Island issue in Japan. One of the members of the cabinet of Japan, of Japanese government, admitted that the Dewey Islands are under dispute, and China and Japan should negotiate to settle the dispute. However, this remark was criticized in Japan. And on September the 5th, the two candidates for leadership election of the Democratic Party of Japan claims that the Dewey Island belonged to Japan and had never belonged to China in history, in order to drum up support. It was therefore suspicious that the incident was premeditated by Japan. And I have some observations about this incident. First, the incident is not isolated. It is consistent with Japanese recent policy on the Dewey Island. First of all, Japan planned to nationalize 25 islands, including the Dewey Islands, in August. Second, the defense of Japan of this year, the annual white paper, which was published this month, expressed concerns about the military development of China and called for strengthening the defense of the islands in the southwest, including the Dewey Islands. Third, Japan has strengthened military cooperation with the U.S. South Korea after the Cheonan incident, which is considered to be more against China than North Korea. Against this background, Japan showed tough stance by using aggressive, dangerous tactic of coalition in the instance. And second, the U.S. element cannot be ignored in the issue of this island and the East China Sea issue. And third, the Dewey Island dispute will last a long time in the future, which can only be managed rather than being resolved in a short time. So in this connection, the doctrine of setting aside disputes and pursuing joint developments advanced by Deng Xiaoping remains to be a wise choice. Last, I would emphasize that a major topic of this conference is history. History is very, very important. We learn lessons from history in order to avoid mistakes we make in the past. If we forget history, history may repeat. We gather here today to discuss and reflect on history in order to build a better future. We settle territory disputes, not only for our generation, but for our future, next generations. We should be aware that maritime delimitation is only the beginning of new history of bilateral relationships, but not the end. Therefore, in territorial disputes, settlement, we should plant seeds of peace rather than hatred for our next future generations. Thank you.
Now, to provide the commentary on the papers that have been presented, Professor Kim, who advised me before the panel began that his written comments that were previously distributed reflect the availability of papers he had as he was writing them, so that his remarks today may be more expansive than the written report you already have.
Hi, everyone. I'm Taehyung Kim from Daemun College. And this is my great privilege to be here. So thank you to the organizers for having me. Looks like many of you seem to be very tired. The conference is getting to an end, so please be a little patient. Or maybe I should sing a song for you to keep you awake, but later. Okay. I'll make my comments not based on the order in the program, but based on the order that I have read. Okay, so the papers deal with new tensions and challenges in Northeast Asia, and there is plenty of it going on, as you all know. First, Dr. Dodden's paper has an interesting title, "The Tea Party of Japan." She shows that what makes them growing and what kind of difference they have from the old boys and what they advocate and things like that. So I'll try to make it short. But the concern that I have for her paper is that her suggestion to make hate speech a crime may not be feasible, because it seems Japan still refused to acknowledge her multi-ethnicity, and henceforth hesitates to promote and protect diversity. And Dr. Masaki's paper begins with the discussion of the Constitution of the constitutional amendment debate, and then linking the constitutional issue with the future of East Asia. Furthermore, Dr. Masaki wants to establish an East Asian regional community by expanding the existing GPPPAC. And the importance of economic security is clearly shown. So Dr. Masaki's argument about the potential danger of neoliberal globalization seems to echo Dr. Dodden's assumption of the contribution of capitalist modernity and its discontents to the growth of ultra-right-wing nationalism. So the potential danger of rising extremism urges the states in the region to work sincerely to cooperate in economic and human security, not just in traditional military security. Regarding the debate on the revision of Article 9 by Dr. Masaki, it looks like there are quite a few examples of interpreting the Constitution in a way for Tokyo to politically and legally circumvent the Article 9 and hereby allow military commitments by the Japan self-defense forces. For example, Japan's participation in the PKO operations brought controversy and anxiety within and without Japan in the 1990s. And Tokyo also dispatched its troops to support the US war efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, although not engaged. Oh, sorry. I didn't realize. Okay. Tokyo also dispatched the troops to support the US war efforts in Iraq and Afghanistan, although not engaging in combat mission. Thus, although Japan de jure adheres to the Article 9, it looks like she has de facto gotten around in many occasions. And Dr. Wang provides an in-depth analysis very strongly of the current dispute over the Dewey and Senkaku Islands in the East China Sea, particularly related with the recent fishing boat incident. This incident has caused serious concern due to its sensitivity in history and emotion. And finally, Dr. Green showed that the Cold War legacy is still everywhere in Asia and suggested how the Cold War will end in the region, especially in the Taiwan Strait and the Korean Peninsula. Yet divergent, as Dr. Green convincingly explained, divergent expectations about how the Cold War will end based on different strategic interests have made progress very slow and painful. All these papers deal with interwoven challenges of history and politics, identity and interests, which makes the establishment of peaceful region full of reconciliation and free from power politics rivalry extremely difficult. I'll begin briefly with the potential danger of history originated. I only use mic when I'm in the singing room and karaoke, so I'm not familiar with this. Sorry. So if it sounds louder, I think it's a good thing, but it may not work that way here. Sorry about that. Okay. So potential danger of history-originated nationalist identity politics. Here I kind of applied the symbolic politics proposed and developed by Stuart Kaufman. According to this theory, people are motivated to act based on emotions, not rational calculations. And the myth-symbol complex leads the people to make political choices based on emotion and in response to symbol. In modern East Asia, each nation has developed its national identity by differentiating each other through interpreting history differently and inheriting unique culture. Oftentimes, this is how history textbooks and media portray nations' identity in each country. There are several outstanding symbols without much material merits, yet have enormous power to motivate people, as in the case of Dr. Takeshima and Dayadao Shenkaku. But although history, region, and symbol motivate all out violence between nations in East Asia, I think is unlikely. But one cannot rule out the possibility of myth-symbol-originated conflicts. In the emotion-filled tension in the region, as shown, the role of the United States would be vital to keep involved parties to stay off from the trouble. On top of this dangerous tendency, there is a tectonic material shift also occurring in the region, the relative decline of the United States and the rising China. China has been the biggest beneficiary of the US hegemonic order, and Beijing has been cautious to avoid open confrontation with the United States. Yet recently, there are several signs of Chinese assertiveness and status-seeking behaviors, which is quite apart from its peaceful rise dictum of reserved and modest behaviors, and seemingly emboldened by its own dramatic economic success and the US recent series of setbacks. For example, as repeatedly mentioned today, Beijing has declared the disputed islands and the sea lanes around it in South China Sea as China's core national interests, which has made the neighbors anxious. The row over the release of crew members of a Chinese ship near the disputed Senkaku Diaoyao Islands, as Dr. Wang shows, also demonstrates how seriously Beijing takes the matter. The sinking of Cheonan in March also shows where Beijing's strategic interests lie in and how divergent those are from other nations in the region, as Dr. Green clearly explained. China's recent assertive foreign policy has caused balancing behaviors by its neighbors, pushing them closer to the United States orbit. Japan, South Korea, Vietnam, Indonesia, etc. In Northeast Asia, this has pushed Japan and Taiwan closer to the United States and North Korea to China. South Korea, the country that has been maintaining military alliance with the United States while relying on China for its economic benefits, opted to be closer to the US at the expense of the worst relationship between Seoul and Beijing since 1992 normalization. Thus, nasty power politics seems to dominate the region, helped by emotion and prestige-laden tension. Under the circumstances, but Dr. Green's suggestion to shape the expectations and calculations of the other powers, especially China, may not be taken very well by Beijing. Therefore, I think it could be counterproductive, given China's definition of strategic interests, which are strongly influenced by its status and privilege desire. And I also wonder, if a country like South Korea, who is a medium state and sandwiched between major powers, can afford to be seen so one-sided for long. Maintaining the security alliance with the United States is paramount importance for Seoul, but distancing from China like this much may not be wise. Then what about the future of East Asia? Despite these tensions, disputes, and conflicts, I'm not that pessimistic because I think soft power, especially cultural exchange, has enormous potential to contribute to bridge the gap among the nations. These papers also demonstrate that the new challenges could provide a source of opportunity for cooperation among the states in such areas as economy and education, as Dr. Dudden and Masaki suggested. Moreover, one historical lesson I think we must learn carefully is the behaviors of major powers in the past and what it implies for the current rivalry between the United States and China in East Asia, which will define the region for the long while. I didn't make much compliments to the presenters, but it doesn't mean I didn't enjoy reading it, nor I didn't respect any of these papers. Thank you very much. I'm sorry for this microphone thing. So, thank you.
I think that I have Victor's leave to take about 10 minutes for questions and comments on the papers, although we're running a bit beyond our scheduled time. I would ask, as in the case of previous panels, that you would identify yourself if you have a question, address it to one of the panelists if you intend to have a particular panelist answer it, and we'll try and take all the questions first and then have the panelists in order answer the questions they think were addressed to them or to the panel as a whole. Yes.
Hello?
Yes,
Okay. Hello. Michael Sutton from East West Center in Washington. My question is addressed to everyone on the panel. Thanking you very much for your very excellent presentations. As Professor Wang said, history is important, but so is demography. And with all the countries that are represented here, only the United States has a near replacement level fertility at the moment, and for a long time. All the other countries in the region are declining in their total fertility rates. So that's something you have in common, Japan, Korea, Taiwan and China. So my question is, does lowest low fertility, which is the condition that Japan, China, Korea and Taiwan share, does that contribute to better, stronger relations between those countries, or does it undermine those relationships? Thank you.
Other questions for our panel? Yes.
This falls, I think, more into a comment. I'm Paul Chamberlain, a Korea specialist. My comment is that it seems to me, listening to this panel and the others, that there are Class A issues and there are Class B issues. The Class A issue, and I see only one, is the resolution of issues on the Korean Peninsula. And the Class B issues are all the others, which is not to say they're unimportant, but the Class A issue is the most important. I appreciate what Mike Green had to say on the subject. I would submit, however, that we should not think about resolution of the Class A issue in terms of contingency planning per se, because that is reactionary in nature. I mean, we have to do contingency planning because you never know what's going to happen. It seems to me what's missing is a strategy by which we will, with our allies and hopefully China, take a more proactive approach to shape the environment and bring about a satisfactory conclusion to the issues at hand. We have to be patient because it's not going to be resolved by the midterm election. But if we don't start on a road to achieve a strategic solution, to expect one at the last minute is unrealistic.
Any other questions for the panel before I turn this over to them? Well, if not, it's been a long day, and I should let them have the last word. It's only appropriate.
Thank you. With regards to the shrinking population question, it's an excellent question, and at least within Japanese terms, it's the million-dollar question, I think. I think it's a 2006 paper by Sakanaka. Some describe him, maybe 2005, some describe him as the doomsday machine in Japan. He's a former Justice Ministry official, in which he posits two potential futures for Japan. Japan opens its immigration policy, allows immediately the advent of 20 million people to live freely, openly, and legally in Japan, to promote an open, healthy society, which he sees, I think it's, forgive me, I think it's 40 years hence, 50 years hence, as a growing, vibrant population of 180 million, leading the world in numerous ways. Option two is to continue along the current immigration policy and find itself with 80 million people in the same 50-year period, as what I would describe as sort of humanitarian Scandinavian-like nation which responds to the occasional earthquake. The heart of this matter, unfortunately, is not demographic, because you're right, demographics are going to determine a lot of this in a probably anti-Malthusian way. It comes down to the question of identity. It comes down, at least within Japanese terms, to the meaning of being Japanese and who counts as Japanese. So unfortunately, in answer to your question, if not handled properly, it could I think, have the opposite effect and be a reification of the meaning of Japanese identity in a negative way. And I guess that's why, while I do completely agree that the people that interest me in Japan right now, the anti-everythingers, if they achieve a platform, they take the debate in an unhealthy direction that only antagonizes other nations with similar shrinking populations. Because you're right, looked at in some ways, this is common ground. Japan is unusual for a nation of its industrial status at the moment, in which it is continuing to urbanize. This is very different, for example, from the United States. And so the pressures on cities, Tokyo achieved, I believe, 20 million this year. They didn't, that move to build into Tokyo Bay didn't happen. So with more people on top of people, more people in a way that who gets to count within society will matter. And so your question is very important. Thank you.
We're having our second child in a month, so I'm doing my patriotic duty to maintain the replacement rate. Professor Cha has 2 children. Most of the CSIS staff has 2 children because we're a Center for Strategic International Studies, and I
have only one, and I'm stopping.
and we recognize that the replacement rate, the replacement rate is critically important. The historical record is mixed, though. I'm tempted to say the one thing you can predict is that if Japan's population continues to decline, Japanese politics will inevitably stabilize because they will run out of new prime ministers. And we'll have a sustained 5 or 10 year cabinet under the last Japanese. On a more serious note, I think the historical record on this is mixed. Edward Luttwak and others have written about the impact of demography on national security or strategic cultures. On the one hand, if you have a replacement rate of 1 point whatever, less than 2, then history suggests that societies become less violent and less war-prone because you have a lot more to lose if you have only 1 child. That's the good news. On the other hand, there are 2 negative impacts I can think of in terms of war and peace in Asia, or the relative belligerence of states' strategic cultures. One, particularly in China, is that if there's a gender imbalance between males and females, that societies might be more prone to belligerence, theoretically at least. And the second one is that the replacement rate dropping this low in very traditional societies like Japan, Korea, or China can cause massive social dislocation. Because people are not able to take care of their parents. And the Kobayashi Yoshinori readership could be 50, 60, 70-year-olds in the future, but lots of them, if you think about the dislocating effect of this gender demographic. I think it's particularly problematic in China in the future because the social safety net is so much weaker. Maybe the Chinese will solve that. But it's potentially quite dislocating. On this general question of demographics and identity, there's some bad news in Japan and Korea. There's some good news, too. Our colleague at Georgetown, Kevin Doak, has written about what he calls civic nationalism, which is contrasted to ethnic nationalism, or minzok shugi. And what's striking among conservatives on the right in both Japan and Korea is the degree to which people like Abe or the Lee Myung-bak government are emphasizing a national identity that has more to do with the Constitution or the flag or a national identity as opposed to an ethnic identity. And that's an identity that's based more on an open society, rule of law. And in the Korean case, we had an excellent paper at Georgetown, won a prize by a student who looked at how these identity politics formation have created a more open political and social environment in Korea for immigration, for example. So the demographics and identity matrix is also can cut both ways. I'm not sure, Paul, whether when you say we're just reacting and we need to be proactive, if you're talking about unification or the nuclear problem. Okay. Yeah, I don't disagree. And the trick is, how do you do it? Because if I'm right that diverging expectations about the next chapter on the Korean Peninsula, the post-Kim Jong-il chapter, are causing tension with Beijing, or between Beijing on the one hand and Seoul, Tokyo, Washington on the other, then if we push really hard from contingency planning and talking about in very generic terms how we deal with this, if we push from that to, as soon as they get wobbly, let's whack them, we risk making the situation much more difficult. And ultimately, one of the great dangers of collapse of North Korea and managing the unification process is how we deconflict and prevent great power rivalry or even conflict. So I agree with you in principle, but I'm not sure how you do it concretely. And I've given this some thought, and there may be ways to do it, and it's a worthy line of inquiry, but a lot trickier when you start thinking about it. But in general, I think your instinct is right.
Okay, just a brief comment to the general point. So I think the Japanese standpoint of view, I think especially the deunification of the Korean Peninsula, this is a vital for the Northeast Asian peace and prosperity. And if we think about from the standpoint of the North Korea is surrounded by the South Korea and Japan, and another pro-diplomatic stance to America. And so, yes, we should admit North Korea is a very, very strange country. And some people say, so this country is so dictatorship. And especially in Japan, it's a very popular, if you go to Japan and watch the TV, it seems to be Kim Jong-il. It's a very, it's a strange person. But the problem is, I think the problem, if the government of the North Korea suddenly collapsed, how about the result? So this point already American government and Japanese government already calculated it, and so many refugees, and we cannot maintain our prosperity. And and this is a very important point. But I think another point is today I think strongly emphasizes in the Japanese Constitution Preamble. This is very unique. That is one word of the right to live in peace. So this is the one phrase. We, the Japanese people, recognize that all peoples of the world have the right to live in peace, free from fear and want. So this is very universal stance. Not only Japanese people, but every country's person have the right to live in peace. So this is a common characteristic with international arguing. We are now arguing in the United Nations of the human security first. So we traditionally think about national security, so we need more military, we need armed forces, we need strong powers. But think about human security first. We need more clean water, we need more basic medicine and the fundamental education. So this is our starting point of argument, I think. Yeah.
Regarding the history, whether the history contributes or undermines the relationship between the countries is concerned, my point is that history is two sides of a coin. If we deal it well, it will promote our good relation. If we forget history or deny history, it will be bad. We reflect on history is for a better future rather than the opposite. On the core issue, I would like to mention something about the so-called core issue that advanced by the Chinese government. First, we have to clarify where is the news come from. I haven't seen any official documents mentioning about the core issue by any Chinese officials. To my knowledge, it comes from a Japanese newspaper. Yeah. Okay. First, this is first point. Second point. If the Chinese senior officer says so, it's nothing wrong. Why? First, the Chinese government constantly mention matters related to territory and sovereignty is a matter of core interest. I think every country and everybody agrees this point. Nobody disagrees on this point. Matters related to sovereignty and territory is core interest to every country. In the past, we refer to Tibet, Xinjiang, and Taiwan as core interest. Since China claimed all the islands in the South China Sea, why China cannot say its core interest? Because it's China's territorial sovereignty. Why not core interest? Thank you.
I think that we should reflect our appreciation of the presentations of the panelists today. You can also probably give yourselves a hand for persisting to this late point of the afternoon. But I think that the intellectual food for thought that we were given was something that well merited your continuing attention until this moment. And I hope you'll join me in thanking our panel.
Before we conclude, I first wanted to thank President Zhang and Dr. Kim Young-Wan from the Northeast Asia History Foundation for a really interesting full day of discussions. I think what we will do now is go back to the papers, seek some revisions, and then move that process forward. But I thought as a first conference on this issue, it was quite interesting, some very interesting papers, very good discussion. There are a few other thank yous, so please remain patient. I want to also thank, there are a number of students here from Georgetown University who, rather than coming to class on Friday with various professors on the stage, they've come here today, and I want to thank them all also for taking the time to come here from campus. Finally, and most importantly, for everything and all the arrangements that were put into this conference, I want to thank our interns, who you see standing on the back here, and especially want to thank Ellen Kim, Kat Harrington, and Delmy Choi. Where's Delmy? Right there. They were the ones who really all made this happen, so thank you very much. President Chung, is there anything that you want to say, or should we adjourn, or? Okay, all right, then President Chung and I, we're going to go have dinner. So all of you have a great weekend, and thank you all for coming.